everyone for coming out tonight, and especially want to thank Nick Bays for inviting me. And I'm encouraged to be here for the second annual program, and I hope to see the third one next year. It's a long drive, but I think I might make it out. I have some prepared remarks, and then we'll get into the heart of what we're talking about tonight. So I wanted to concentrate on the fact of what an exciting time it is in the 21st century to be a Christian. The more advances we make in science, the more evidence there is that supports the truth of Christianity, but also demonstrates the benefits that Christianity brings to individuals, to families, and to our social institutions. In the academic realm of philosophy, since the 1950s, new arguments for the existence of God have been developed, and through careful analytical study, older arguments for the existence of God from Plato, Aristotle, and other ancient philosophers have been refined to the point that there is now a renaissance of Christian theology in academic philosophy departments and societies of philosophy. In physics, cosmology, and astronomy, discoveries over the past 100 years have now given us strong scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning in the finite past, and therefore must have been a product of a supernatural creator. In just the past few decades, further studies of the nature of the universe itself have demonstrated it to be incredibly fine-tuned for human life to exist, with such a mind-boggling level of sophistication that provides strong evidence for the existence of a loving, all-knowing creator. Even one of the world's leading atheist philosophers, Antony Flew, after examining the evidence for fine-tuning, turned his back on the atheism he had promoted for more than 50 years and became a theist in 2004. Now, turning from the macro world to the micro world, the discoveries over the past few decades by microbiologists and geneticists have been just as earth-shaking. The electron scanning microscope has revealed the living cell to be an incredibly complex system of thousands of intricately coordinated tiny nano machines, like a vast automated city of robots building and repairing other robots for the purpose of manufacture and transportation, communication, energy supply, defense, and propagation. All the information that tells these machines what to build and when is stored in the DNA that itself is controlled by and repaired by other machines whose blueprints are also encoded on the very DNA that they repair. And this chart, each of these blips outside this DNA strand here, is a machine that is involved in the breeding and production and repair of the DNA. And all of those machines are themselves encoded in the DNA itself. Geneticists now know that the DNA is multi-encoded to provide backup systems for backup systems, with large sections of the DNA code turned off and maintained for future use in case of changing climate, food sources, or other environmental stresses, so that the organism can adapt by re-engineering its offspring to a changing environment and survive. In the face of this overwhelming evidence and the collapse of the major evidences for evolution, atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a book in November last year subtitled "Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False." And this is where we will spend most of our time tonight. But furthermore, every turn of the archaeologist's spade in the past century has only piled evidence upon evidence for the reliability of the biblical record. While some atheist scholars still cling to their discredited 19th century theories of a non-miraculous Bible history, the mounting evidence supports both historical details, such as the presence of Joseph as vizier in Egypt, to the miraculous events, such as the resurrection of Jesus. New arguments for the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation for the now established fact of the crucifixion, the empty tomb, and the post-mortem appearances of a risen Jesus are being vigorously defended thanks to the scholarly consensus that these evidences are in fact facts of history. The teachings of the greatest man who ever lived, Jesus the Messiah, impacted the world for good as no one ever has. In the field of history, researchers have drawn connections between the teachings of Christianity and the development of behaviors and institutions that have led directly to the dramatic improvement of human flourishing. Down through the centuries, including the establishment of hospitals, universities, free market economies, and truly democratic societies. Christianity rid the world of such evils as infanticide and the treatment of women as property. It twice rid the world of slavery, once during the Roman Empire and again after the colonial period. Multiple historians have now documented how the direct teaching of Christian principles led to the beginning of the scientific study of God's world and the birth of the scientific method. In fact, almost every founder of a new branch of science was a devout Christian creationist scientist. Even sociologists, psychologists, and neurologists in their studies have demonstrated the benefit of Christianity to the individual for mental and physical health, including lifespan, happiness, and lack of stress, marital success, and significant reductions in depression, drug abuse, and criminal behavior. One atheist author who researched the data openly proclaimed that he would rather trust a Christian than any atheist. The truth of Christianity is based solidly on evidence and reason, and makes the world a better place by making people better human beings. All this evidence, and much more, supporting the truth and benefits of Christianity has become so large that Christian universities and seminaries have begun building new departments and programs and training graduate students in this rapidly expanding field of Christian apologetics, which is the defense of Christianity. And that is where I have my degree in Master's in Christian Apologetics. I think you should become a Christian, and I want to show you why. So for the next 45 minutes, we're going to look at 6 facts dealing with evolution that will prove what Thomas Nagel said, why the materialist neo-Darwinian concept of nature is almost certainly false. So let's get into our specific topic. And evolution seems to be one of the big stumbling stones for people who are considering Christianity as an option, as a worldview. So I'm going to be covering 6 facts. The first is that there are 2 kinds of evolution, and this is not what is not clearly understood, and we have to understand it. Micro and macro evolution. So we'll get into that. All the standard evidences for evolution have collapsed, and we'll get into that. DNA has been shown now to be programmed to re-engineer itself. Organisms have been demonstrated to only be able to change within their kind. Okay? And finally, this may surprise you, but we're going to look at the evidence for a worldwide flood, and we're going to look at the evidence for a young Earth. Okay, micro and macro evolution. Evolutionists distinguish between micro and macro. This is a term of evolutionists, not a term of creationists. It was first coined by Theodosius Dobzhansky in the 1960s, one of the foremost evolutionary scientists. And what he pointed out is that microevolution is small adaptive changes that are channeled by natural selection to produce variety in organisms through the genetic expression of existing information in a gene pool. Okay, so what's a gene pool? Well, a gene pool is the genetic information that's available to a specific kind of organism. So, for example, the genes that are available to dogs, right? All the dog genes, okay? Now, that's more information than is contained in a single organism. So a single dog may be missing some of the genetic information that's available to other dogs. The person on your left or your right has different genes from you that you may not have. Okay? Some different genetic information. But also, a single organism, a single individual, has more genetic information than they need themselves. So you're not using all the genetic information that you have. There's genetic information in you that is turned off, and that may be used in future generations. Your grandson, your great-great-granddaughter may use that information to help them survive. So microevolution is changes the future offspring that are caused frequently by turning on unused DNA information. This is also called cryptic genes. So we know that there are genes that are hidden, that have been set aside, not being used by organisms, and they are turned on. And sometimes other areas may be turned off. There's also copying errors, right? That's what we typically think of as mutations. Copying errors and mistakes can also cause changes through lost information or broken genes. But not all mutations are copying errors. Mutations is the term we use, but that just means changes into the DNA. Some are accidental, but many are actually caused by the organism. This is something that we have only learned about the past 10 years. So the DNA re-engineers itself in order to survive in a new or changing environment. They have even found some organisms that will actually sample the environment. So a living cell is sampling the environment, looking for food sources, and then it will turn on the DNA that it needs for its offspring. Okay, well then what's macroevolution? Macroevolution is the theoretical addition of new genetic information to a gene pool. Okay, and this is the problem, right? The information needed to make some new kind of organ or a new limb, like a wing, in a kind of animal that doesn't have wings, like for dogs. Let's say the new information that a dog kind would need in order to become flying dogs, okay? Or some new biochemical pathway. For example, dinosaurs becoming birds, right? What would they need? What kind of new information would dinosaurs need to turn into birds? Well, they have to have a completely different kind of skeletal system. They have to have a completely different kind of respiratory system. They have to have, obviously, a different kind of locomotion. Instead of walking, they're flying now. And they have to have a different kind of skin system, right? Feathers instead of scales. So this is where the problem comes in. By confusing these two concepts, micro and macro, evolutionists use the evidence for micro, which is real. Microevolution is real change. Change over time. Animals do change over time. But they use that evidence to try to prove macroevolution, the development of new information. All the evidence used to support macroevolution, such as bacterial resistance, peppered moths, and on, are all actually examples of microevolution and not macroevolution. So when someone asks you, do you believe in evolution? What you need to ask is, what are you talking about? Are you talking about microevolution, which is proved, or macroevolution, which is theoretical? I say it's mythical. This is the kind of evolution you get. A wolf can change into a chihuahua. A fish cannot change into a fisherman. It requires too much new information that is not there. Right? How to make a fisherman isn't there. How to make a microbiologist is not in bacteria. How to make a prince is not in a frog. So let's talk about some of the discredited evidences. Again, these are meant to prove evolution, but they don't prove macroevolution, they prove microevolution. So we've got the Darwin's finch beaks, probably seen that in your textbooks. Peppered moths. Whale evolution is a common one, until last year, that is. Antibiotic resistance, we talked a little bit about that. The tree of life is given to show, oh look, everything is connected. Embryology, anybody seen Haeckel's embryos? Right? Still today, that's an amazing thing. We'll talk about that. Let's see if my clicker's going to work. Technology. There we go. Chimp DNA, right? It's supposed to be almost identical to human DNA. Is that really true? And homology or similarity, similar designs, is that because everybody's related to everything else? And the fossil record. Okay. Darwin's finch beaks have been used to prove evolution. It shows microevolution. It shows change within the information that's already there. And what we find is that it's just cyclical, right? These beak sizes change depending on the climate and the weather patterns in the Galapagos Islands. They cycle back and forth, and they don't turn into anything else because there isn't any new information about how to build anything else. Peppered moths, right? Is this in your textbooks? Peppered moths, we know, cycle back and forth. So they cycle back from dark and light. And there's genetic information for both, and that's what happens. But nothing new ever comes, because the information is all that there is. Now, flu strains is another one. I was speaking with the microbiologist at University of Pennsylvania who is on the board that determines what flu vaccine you're going to get next year. And he explained exactly how they do it. They look at all the strains that come out. So there are several strains that will come out during the year. And they have to decide what's going to happen to that flu virus next year. So what they do is they look and see which of the strains is most like the wild type, the original type, the one that has the most oldest information in it, not the one that has mutated the most. Because they know that next year, it's all going to be back the way it was. So if you got your flu vaccine, you unwittingly admitted that evolution is impossible. Because if evolution was true, the mutated strains would be the ones that would protect you, because that's going to continue to mutate and change and change. But they know that that's not going to happen. Those mutated strains have lost information, they're weaker, they're more likely to die out. So they give you the one that is the original wild type. It's just like that chihuahua that I showed you. What do you think happens to the chihuahua? It doesn't get eaten. If you let it out into the wild, right, and it doesn't stay purebred, eventually it becomes a mutt again, right? Generations later, it'll be a mutt. And if enough genetic information from different breeds combine, you will get back to the original wolf kind. That wild dog will be very much like Middle Eastern wolf. All right, what about whale evolution? This is a popular one these days because some of the other ones have been criticized so much. So you'll see examples of a terrestrial wolf-like creature, supposed to be about 50 million years old, that over the period of about 10 million years completely transforms into a completely different type of animal. Now, this is really incredible. I mean, 10 million years for that level, especially when you consider that whales and you know, the ocean version of the transitional form comes pretty early. They only have offspring once per year. This really slows down evolution. It's not at all like other creatures like fruit flies or bacteria that reproduce really rapidly, so you can see evolution happening or change happening much quicker. So this is supposed to have happened over about 10 million years until 2011, the discovery of the oldest fully aquatic whale, dating to 49 million years ago. Means that the time frame is now down to only a million years. So this is what you would have seen, these transitional forms, but now, 1 million years later, you have a fully aquatic whale. Okay, what about antibiotic resistance? This seems to be a real stumper, right? I mean, don't we see when you go to the hospital and they have these warnings, alerts about this antibiotic-resistant bacteria, or MRSA, right? You've got to be very careful. Well, bacteria gain resistance to antibiotics by losing information. They lose the information on how to digest the antibiotic, because the antibiotic kills the bacteria by being digested and turning into a toxin, turning into a poison that kills the bacteria. So if it loses the information and it can no longer digest that antibiotic, that allows the bacteria to live. It can survive because it's lost information. But it can't survive outside of the hospital, right? Because it's weak, it's weakened, it's lost information, and it needed that information for other purposes. So this is a downward change. And downward change is what actually happens. So people say, well, if microevolution is true, and we do have animals changing, why can't, if we just wait long enough, why can't we get macroevolution? Why can't we have big changes? Well, you will get big changes, but they're always in the wrong direction. If we're in a skyscraper and we start going downstairs, how long will it take us to get to the roof? You are going in the wrong direction. If I throw rocks at a house, can I change it? Right? Well, if I throw rocks at it for long enough, I can change it. I might even be able to turn someone's bedroom into a porch, right? Into an open area if I throw rocks at it for long enough. Could I change that house into a skyscraper? No. If I threw rocks at it for 1 million years, eventually you'd have a pile of dust. So you would get big change. You do. Lots of small change together can make big change. It's just all bad. You get no new information. Okay, what about the tree of life? Darwinists claim that they can draw a tree of life that's a structure that shows how all the organisms are related to a common ancestor. The problem is that almost every attempt is full of inconsistencies. And every time they try a different way of doing it, they can do it based on morphology, right, the shape of animals, or they could try to do it based on certain proteins. But then you get a completely different tree. It's so troubling to evolutionists that a lot have even abandoned the effort, as reflected in a 2009 New Science article titled, "Why Darwin Was Wrong About the Tree of Life." Now, Somebody raised their hand that they've seen this in their textbooks, which is sad, because this is a known, documented fraud. This is one of 3 frauds that Ernst Haeckel, professor in the 19th century, committed. These are his drawings. You can see how he tried to make the drawing. Now, he was not an embryologist, by the way, and that's how he got caught. Because the leading embryologist at his university called him out and took him for disciplinary action, and he was kicked out of his university for faking these drawings. But that was in Germany in the 19th century. His book was translated into English, and it took the English world by storm. All right. So how are we doing for time? Because, well, I took a couple of slides out, but we'll just move on. So you can see how really different these stages are. And the interesting thing is that as far as stages of life go, these were not selected because they were in the same stage of life. They were selected because this is when they look most alike. All right? So this is the time they look the most alike, and they look very different. But these are different stages of development. But Haeckel tried to make them all look the same. And that's what you've been taught in school, unfortunately. So it was only a year after he published these pictures, that he was caught as a fraud. But it's still being used. Okay, chimp-human similarities. We hear that all the time, right? 98% similarity. Right? Anybody heard that? If you guys are, yeah? Okay, I see some hands. Is that really true? 98% similar human DNA. What people don't realize is that study that was done that gets promoted so much was only of small segments of DNA that were already known to be similar. The biggest difference between humans and chimps is not what proteins are made, but how they're regulated, how they're controlled by the DNA. And that takes a lot of DNA information, and it's very different. One example is that the chimp genome, right, which is the total amount of DNA, is actually 10 to 12% larger than human DNA. So already, it's more than 98, right? You're 80, what, 88%? So just from that, just from the size. But actually large blocks of dissimilarity exist in a number of key chromosomes, including marked structural differences between the entire male Y chromosome. The similarity between a human male chromosome and a chimp male chromosome is about 70%, which is the same as the similarity between a male chromosome and a chicken Y chromosome. All right, well, you've seen these charts too, right? It's called homology, right? Or similarity. The problem is that it could equally be because of a common ancestor or because of a common designer. So how are you going to tell the difference? How are you going to know whether it's a common design or it's because every animal is a descendant of a previous animal? The problem is these structures don't share the same genetic pathways. So as the organism is growing, the pathway to get to this design uses completely different developmental pathways. Even where evolutionists are certain that a particular animal did not share common ancestry for most of their development, many of these features recur because they're intelligent, engineered designs. An example is the whale and bat sonar. Right? It turns out that those systems even use the same genetic information. The genes are the same, but they're not related, right? Bats are not related to whales. Okay, well, so far what we've done is we've looked at theoretical issues and we've compared it to what's really going on. But for me, what's important about science is the experimental evidence. Okay? What you can prove repeatedly over and over. So why don't we just ask the evolutionists to do some experiments and prove evolution? Right? If you just experiment, you should be able to produce some new information. If evolution will create new information, let's do it. Well, oh wait, they already did the experiments. Right? Do you know what they were? Have you heard of them? Maybe you've heard of them and maybe you haven't, because they don't prove any new information at all. We'll look at fruit fly experiments and we'll look at the bacterial longevity experiments that have been done. So what happens when you try to experiment and you try to change organisms? It's the same thing that breeders run into. So in a sense, breeding has been an evolutionary experiment that's gone on for centuries. Right? People have been breeding horses, breeding dogs, breeding roses. And what happens is that they reach limits beyond which they cannot go. It's true for everything: dogs, corn, pigeon breeders, roses. All breeders know this. As an example, we know, we've done DNA studies of dogs. All dogs are related and descended from the Middle Eastern wolf. But you reach a limit. You can only get so small. You can only get so big. Dogs have a lot of diseases. Dachshunds have a kind of dwarfism. Great Danes have essentially the same thing as giantism in people. Okay? And they have a lot of problems. A lot of cancer, back issues, digestive problems. When they get so much lost information, it's very difficult for them to survive. And if you put a lot of the purebred dogs out in the wild, they did not survive. Fruit fly experiments, they took fruit flies because they reproduced very rapidly, and they irradiated them to cause an increased number of mutations so that they could speed things along. They mutated every single base pair. That's the individual code on the DNA, right? The nucleotides. Every single one, individually or in groups, and failed to produce anything but crippled fruit flies. So that's the equivalent of millions of years worth of evolution that were simulated with no result. So, Drosophila, and this was started 100 years ago. 100 years ago was the first report of irradiated fruit flies, and following the generation after generation after generation, trying deliberately to create some kind of new information. And you get nothing but diseased, deformed, and damaged fruit flies. So much so, here's a couple of quotes. Homeotic changes induced in fruit fly genes have led only to monstrosities. Here's from my biology professor. If mutation were a variation of value to the species, then the evolution of the fruit fly should have proceeded with extreme rapidity. Yet the facts entirely contradict the validity of this theoretical deduction. And about mutations, Lynn Margulis, biologist, said, never, however, did that one mutation make a wing, a fruit, a woody stem, a claw appear. Mutations, in summary, tend to induce sickness, death, and deficiencies. No evidence in the vast literature of hereditary changes shows unambiguous evidence that random mutation itself, even with geographical isolation of populations, leads to speciation. Okay, what about bacterial experiments? Bacteria are great to work with because they can reproduce. You can get a new family in 20 minutes. So what happens when you study them for over 20 years, as has been done, and you get up to 56,000 generations? What happens? Believe it or not much. You get about 10 to 20 fixed mutations that help the bacteria to adapt to the new situation, which is being stored in a beaker for 20 years. And they actually had a case of one cryptic gene that got turned on. It was able to live off of one of the ingredients in the agar that they were growing the bacteria in. And that's it. Most of them, this is very interesting, most of them occurred right away. So by 5,000 generations, almost all the changes were done. Because that was the bacteria, the DNA, re-engineering itself, flipping things on and turning things off, trying to survive as best it could. So DNA is pre-programmed to turn on the information needed to survive and increase efficiency in a new environment. Okay, what about the fossil record? This is often used as, well, okay, but we can't see macroevolution, but if you look at the fossil record, you've got macroevolution. That's kind of a written history of evolution, right? Well, here's what Charles Darwin said. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain as this. Perhaps this is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. I agree with it. Okay, well, that was a long time ago. Maybe they found things recently. Well, here's paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard. The history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism or gradual change of organisms. Number one, stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological, right, that's shape change is usually limited and directionless. Number two, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. So the progression of fossils is not smooth. There are numerous fossil graveyards that have been reported where both land and sea creatures are mixed together, not supposed to happen. The Cambrian explosion of life has revealed life's complexity from the very beginning, so you get virtually nothing, single-cell bacteria, and then suddenly you get almost every single body plan that there is. The vast array of complex life that appears in the lowest geologic strata with no ancestors goes very hard against evolutionary dogma. An example of this was the discovery in 1940 of fossils of amazing clarity and diversity that were found in Canada's Burgess Shale. This is all Cambrian explosion material. This deposit unveiled numerous new fossil types, but none of them were primitive in any sense, nor were they ancestral to any other type. Okay, so here we get to something very controversial. There's just kind of fun being controversial. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon, obviously, and this is strata up close. But whether you look at it from a distance or up close, you see some very interesting things. For one thing, some of these rock layers cover all of North America, virtually all of North America, and some even go into Russia. So how are these getting laid down, right? An old Earth scientist would say this is laid down millions of years before this one, which was millions of years before this one, millions of years before this one, millions of years before this one, etc., etc., etc. But notice a few things. These all have razor-sharp edges, right? These are all sedimentary. They're all laid down by water, massive amounts of water, and yet the lines are all perfectly straight. Where are the tree roots? Are you telling me that there were no large trees for millions and millions and millions of years? Where are the animal burrows? There are no animal burrows. Just clear razor-sharp levels. There's no signs of erosion. A few rare spots where you can find some erosion. But for the most part, there's no erosion. Certainly nothing like this. I mean, look at how it's been cut away after it was laid down. There's erosion for you. Cut down through the entire canyon. But nothing like that is uncovered. When you look at what was below, there's no old canyon there. No earthquake evidence. Millions and millions of years, no earthquake evidence. All laid down simultaneously. That's what it looks like. Experiments. Experiments are what tells us what really happens. This is from a very famous among some areas, a geologist who took 8 tons of sand that was randomly mixed in different thicknesses of sand and showed that by flowing it through a flume with a glass wall, you could create the strata. It's all created simultaneously. Right? Just moving water, and the sand all sifts out. This has been confirmed by observations at deltas, river deltas. So sedimentologists who study bays and areas where rivers dump sediment out into the water, you get this strata forming simultaneously. Right? Not one layer, and then another layer, and then another layer. All the layers come out simultaneously. It's also even not at the shoreline. The deep sea driller Glomar Challenger also confirmed this same activity happening out in the ocean. This is a picture that I took when I was with a geologist in the Grand Canyon. And this is proof that all these layers were all soft at the same time. Look at that bend. There are no breaks there, right? It didn't break, it didn't snap, it didn't crack. It just bent because all those layers were laid down simultaneously in a single flood at the same time. And then there was an uplift, and that stuff all just slumped over. Multiple examples of this just in the Grand Canyon, let alone around the world. Here's a really interesting picture. So somebody might say, okay, well, maybe it was just pressure over a long period of time and it slowly bent like that. Okay? We got a couple problems. The rock's got to go somewhere, right? So you don't see it, the rock below it moving away, but also it doesn't metamorphose, right? Rock under pressure, if it's pressurized for over a long period of time, it metamorphs. So, but here is proof that doesn't involve the possibility of a short distance of time. This is from Dinosaur Ridge, and if you go behind this rock face, there's a big plateau area where there's a lot of dinosaur footprints. And you can see the dinosaur footprints going from heavy to lighter and lighter until finally the dinosaur is barely touching the ground anymore, and you even get its claws scratching the mud as the water rises and it starts to swim. But this is actually a dinosaur footprint right here. And it stepped into, all these layers have been laid down, and it stepped in, and look what it did. It deformed about at least five separate layers were deformed and pushed down. And then, when his foot came out, before this could fill in, this next layer came in and filled it all in. So this is all part of this layer here. That proves that these layers were soft. That dinosaur stepped into the mud and deformed all those layers before he drowned. Okay, so if there was a worldwide flood, maybe the earth is young. Maybe dinosaurs are not as old as they claim to be, right, as they're claimed. What do you find in a 100-million-year-old dino bone? These are actually pictures from a 68-million-year-old bone, but other 100-million-year-old dinosaur bones have been found that have the same thing. These are actually flexible blood vessels. Those are blood vessels that are supposed to have survived more than 80 million years. Dinosaurs supposedly went extinct in 65 million years ago. Springy tissue, connective tissue, and looky there, blood. Now, when this was presented, it was Dr. Mary Schweitzer, who actually wasn't the first one, but she was the first evolutionist with the guts to publish this. It had actually been, fresh dinosaur bones had actually been found before. But she was too big of a name to be ignored. She said, I found red blood cells in the dinosaur bone. And of course the creationist said, well, okay, here's proof. And the evolutionist said, no. She didn't say she found red blood cells. She said she saw red blood cells, but they're not really red blood cells. After all, there's no hemoglobin. So then she tested for hemoglobin, and there was hemoglobin. So the evolutionist said, no. It doesn't matter. Okay, so there's hemoglobin, but there's no DNA. Because they knew that DNA could not survive. Studies had been done already that clearly established that DNA cannot survive more than 10,000 years. Guess what? Dr. Schweitzer proved that there is DNA there. And now, I was just doing an update for my update. I was just reading today. She also found not only red blood cells, but she found osteocytes, which are the bone cells themselves. Not just the bone. There's fresh bone that has not been turned into a fossil, but also the cells themselves, the bone cells, osteocytes, she has found. What's new? Last year, August, at a geology conference, a team of physicists presented the fact that they had taken fresh dinosaur bones and carbon-14 tested them. And they're young. The carbon-14 tests showed they were only thousands of years old, not millions. Now, carbon-14, nobody had ever tested dinosaur bones before. For one thing, because dinosaur fossils are supposed to be rock. They're not supposed to be bone. They long ago would have changed and permineralized and become just mineral. Right? So no one ever did it. Why would you? Then they find that, we have dinosaur bones that haven't mineralized. It takes hundreds of years, thousands even, to mineralize a bone. But here were bones that hadn't been completely mineralized. Still, nobody thought to test them for carbon-14. Now it's been done in the carbon-14. So why they wouldn't do it is because the testing of carbon-14 is only good for items that are younger than 60,000 years. If something is older than 60,000 years, it doesn't have any more carbon-14 in it. There's no point in even looking for it. And that's why nobody ever did until now. In In 2012, last year, August, they took 10 different samples from 8 different dinosaur bones that gave dates of thousands, not millions. So now people have done other things. They've carbon tested diamonds. And guess what? You get a positive reading. The carbon-14 isn't gone. There's still carbon-14 in diamonds, coal, wood that has been trapped in layers that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old, and still carbon-14 dates thousands of years. Okay. How are we doing for time? All right, let me try and wrap this up. We'll have to go fast over the next couple slides. I don't know if you're familiar with the National Geographic effort to map human migration through DNA studies. A couple things I want to point out. One is the way they tell how you migrated, how the people migrated, they look for the loss of information, because that's the change that actually happens. So human beings that traveled the furthest and have traveled down here have lost the most information. That's how they know that this came last. So you can see the dates that they estimated. So you have this area here with the strongest, most amount of DNA information, and then it branches off, and when they move away, so when a group of people moved away from the rest of the population, they lost some of the information that was here. And I just want to point out that this migration pattern matches the Bible's table of nations. In chapter 11 of Genesis, it lists who went where after the Tower of Babel, and matches this pattern. Okay, so what about cavemen then? Somebody asked me to talk about cavemen, so just real briefly, it's likely that Noah and family were Homo erectus, right? And they evolved, because microevolution happens even to human beings. So they evolved eventually to Homo sapien, probably by the time of Abraham. They also lost a lot of longevity. But we know a couple of things. Oh, and then also Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon branched off. There's some other families. You've heard of the Hobbit people, right? Those are fully human people, but they're just small. And there's a couple others. So, but a limited gene pool, all they have to do is lose part of the genetic information that's available to all humans, and they will change shape, change morphology, because you don't have the same information anymore. Evolutionary geneticists like James Crow, who unfortunately just died recently, have recognized and published that cavemen were genetically superior to human beings. Right? I think you've probably heard Neanderthal men had much heavier, thicker bones. Their teeth were much stronger. They had a bigger brain size, right? Did you know that? Neanderthals had bigger brains. Okay, so let's try and wrap up. We've got measurable carbon-14 levels in old material. We have intact dinosaur bone contents, including blood cells and bone cells. There's a dearth of, or a lack of ancestors in the fossil record. We've got bone graveyards of billions of marine and land life mixed together. We'll skip this part. This is interesting. Well, briefly. That's a rock cutting from 1100 AD. And that is in a group. It's in a group of different animals, all of them alive today. This is not a group of mythical animals. And this is from a 1500s, about 1500 tapestry. Long before anybody knew anything about dinosaurs. And actually, there's enough of this that I could have done an entire hour talk on just these kinds of drawings and sculptures and things from around the world, from ancient civilizations. But I want to review now. The evidence for evolution fails under careful study. Evolution cannot produce new information, right? Universes don't pop out of nothing. Life doesn't come from non-life. Multicellular life doesn't just spring out of individual single cells. DNA is pre-programmed to re-engineer itself to allow animals to survive while they spread over the earth. And sedimentary experiments support a worldwide flood. Fresh dinosaur bones support a young earth. So that's where we've been. Oh, and carbon-14 supports a young earth also. So that's where we've been. I've shown you a lot of evidence. I mentioned about the advantages, both personally and to family and to institutions of Christianity. And that's the best reason for becoming a Christian, not because it benefits you, but because it's true. So that's my talk. So we're going to open up for questions. So we have a microphone.
We do. We do. Pete, first of all, thank you for taking this trip. I do want to take advantage of the fact that Keith is here and open up the questions. I'm actually going to put this microphone right here, and I'm going to find out if anyone is interested in coming up. I'd ask you to just don't be shy. I've got a couple of questions we can start out with, but if you've got a couple of questions for Keith, I'd encourage you to come up and use the microphone so that everybody can hear your question, and we'll go from there. If you're interested in asking a question, if you could stand up, at least right now, give me a sense for how many people we're going to have. Come on, it's not that hard. Keith, I'm going to add. Come on, that's what I'm talking about. Say some call. That's what I want.